In about a month's time, we will be hitting the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What is the state of the war, and where does it go from here? In this week's episode, I talk with Katerji. Oz is a war correspondent and journalist who has covered wars in Iraq, Syria, and Ukraine, and has bylines in Rolling Stone, The New Statesman, Foreign Policy, Vice, and many other publications. Oz has spent a significant part of the last year on the ground in Ukraine, and we talk about what he saw in his time there, why so many experts got the invasion wrong, how open source intelligence is revolutionizing war reporting, and where he sees the conflict going from here. As always, if you want to support the podcast, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/Neoliberal Podcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guest today is Katerji. Oz, welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so I think we should just start with getting people familiar with who you are. If they haven't followed your work, I'd be more than happy to introduce them to your work, but I'll let you take a first stab at it. How long have you been covering conflicts like this, and why did you decide to go to Ukraine in January of 2022?
At the start of my career as a journalist, I didn't have like a formal journalist education. I studied language at university. So I just kind of got thrown into it as I got an internship in a newspaper, an English language newspaper in Beirut in the Middle East. My focus always really was the Middle East more than anything. And, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that I wanted to get into the war side of things as a young man. It's just sort of covering the Middle East is always what I wanted to do. And that obviously at times led to covering conflicts, which is an unfortunate element of the job. It's not like war journalists relish war. Quite the opposite in my regard anyway. It's something that I abhor and that I feel, like it's a responsibility of people that have the kind of political literacy on these subjects to speak out and, cover them as best as possible.
Is that a belief that you get sometimes, a mistaken kind of assumption people have that war correspondents must be these like cowboys who love conflict and are like excited by the prospect of being there?
I don't know that all war correspondents are given that label, but because of my outspoken, position on things like the responsibility to protect, my opposition to the Assad regime, these political positions that I hold do not influence, my reporting when I'm objectively covering what happened in X location, who did it, why was, the whole list of things you go through when reporting something. None of my political position changes any of that, right? But unlike other correspondents, I don't just leave it at that. I feel obligated, like morally responsible for the stories that I tell and to advocate for them. It's not something that I leave, at the door once I finish something. So I think that does, not that it sets me apart from people, because it's not like I wouldn't say that it's a positive thing. I think I get a lot of stigma for, I would never refer to myself as an activist. It's just not a label that I feel comfortable with. But I think people, would probably label me as a sort of activist journalist, which I think, I think some people would maybe justifiably say that that's not objective reporting. I mean, I would disagree, and I would also argue that having met many war journalists, my colleagues, I would argue that all of them have very, very strong opinions on these matters and do frequently argue about them in private with, among friends and colleagues. It just, they don't feel that it's something that they should also broadcast to the world, especially not with their full throat.
Well, and it sounds like you're talking about the difference between like objectivity, which is probably a good thing, and neutrality, which is maybe not necessarily a good thing when you're covering a war. It's hard to be neutral when, the Ukrainian government says this is an illegal act of aggression, this invasion is wrong, and the Russian government says they're all a bunch of Nazis. So really, who's to say,
I mean, look, that is dealt with objective reporting, right? You can objectively talk about Ukraine's far right, how prevalent it is in society, how much political clout it has within the country, and you can also, say that you can objectively look at that and say none of that would justify Russia's reasons for invasion. That's not an issue. It's also things like advocating for weapons deliveries to Ukraine, especially before the invasion. That's a line that a lot of people wouldn't cross. But I cannot be neutral in situations of injustice. I stand with the victim, and that is something that is a cast iron core belief of mine. So, and when I see a victim, I advocate on their behalf. It's just what I got in this business to do. And, I think that maybe that rubs some people up the wrong way. Maybe they wouldn't see it the same way I do. But, if I'm asked why, those are the reasons that I give. And circling back to Ukraine, I mean, this is the crux of the matter, really, isn't it? I've been covering Syria for so long and Russia's involvement in Syria and how the world never really took it seriously. In fact, most of the time they were just sort of, on board with Russia's what they would call anti-terror work in Syria, when what they were doing was ruthlessly bombing hospitals, maternity wards, bread lines, marketplaces, just punishing the civilian population of Syria for turning against their fascist dictatorship. It's having covered that for so long, a lot of people in my position knew what was coming in Ukraine from 2014 onwards. I mean, again, you hear some of the arguments people couldn't point to Ukraine on a map before 20. I'm sorry. Most of us were talking about Ukraine really, really extensively from 2014 onwards. Again, most of the world didn't care. They were happy to let Putin carve off a little chunk of Ukraine, and it didn't affect anything to do with their relationship with, fossil fuels or whatever have you. It's madness, and those of us who saw what was the building of an expansionist, revanchist, fascist dictatorship in Russia. A lot of us were labeled alarmists, hysterical. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why I have so many critics, is because I went into this war expecting an utter human catastrophe brought against the world by Russia. I think a lot of people were caught off guard by that. And that says something about them, not me. I wasn't screaming into the void because I was hysterical about, an imagined threat from Russia. I was reporting on what they were doing to civilians in Syria, and no one cared. And they were doing it to civilians in Ukraine, and no one cared. And because no one cared, they carried on and carried on and carried on. And we've been here before. This is a pattern we've seen before. It's a pattern we've seen before so many times in history. And I'm not some, I'm going to swear here. I'm not some sort of fucking savant, some sort of Nostradamus for predicting what was very clear. The signs were that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and they were trying to completely eradicate Ukraine as a nation.
Well, let's talk about those signals, and I want to get to the important part about the eradication as well. But I very clearly remember back in January and February, there was this intense kind of pitched information battle, even just among the West. You know, I remember like official U.S. government sources, and I'm an American, so I pay attention to like what the Department of State is saying and what like the CIA is saying. And, you know, kind of these American operations were saying like Russia really might actually invade Ukraine. Like this is very, very serious. And people from all sorts of political spectrums, the far left, the far right, were just, you know, how could you trust the CIA? How could you trust, you know, America is the one responsible for overthrowing states? Russia would never do that. It seems like even more reasonable people sometimes got caught up in that. And I wonder, was there some sort of like guiding principle for who was actually able to make this call correctly and who was caught up in this like, oh, you're falling for CIA propaganda kind of line?
I think those of us who covered Syria extensively knew what was coming. I mean, I don't want to, you know, say that I'm any different, because there are fucking loads. There are fucking loads of us. I built, but listen, I built a large social media following during the war in Ukraine. But before that, I was just, you know, one of hundreds of like, you know, journalists without many huge bylines doing OSINT stuff, just covering Syria for just driven to cover Syria, even when there was no money in it, even when there was no byline in it. We were just doing it because we cared. And I think those of us involved, I think the people that take open source intelligence seriously are the people that were the easiest to adapt to this. Yeah, there are some blackguards. There are some people that, you know, pretend to be OSINT accounts and do very little work in that regard. But the really serious people, they saw the warning signs, right? You know, examples of this. Russia, the reports came through that Russia had blood banks and mobile crematorium with them on the border, right? People either took those reports seriously or people dismissed them. Those reports they came quite late on. I'd already made my mind up that I thought what was going to happen before then, but those were like the signs that this was imminent. And I think a lot of people just dismissed facts over prejudices, I guess. And I don't mean that in, you know, I mean prejudices such as Russia is a great power. They wouldn't do something so crazy and fascist, you know. A lot of people genuinely believed that Vladimir Putin and Russia could not possibly do something this evil. They genuinely believed it to their core. And I want to say, yeah, the far right and the far left. I mean, I've spent a career, you know, ripping on those morons. But it wasn't just them. It was the realists. There were many liberals that were out there saying, you know, we need a, you know, a sensible relationship with Russia. We need you know, this is not something that you can just dismiss as the fringes, especially not as a left-leaning liberal. You know, there are a lot of very, very hyper-capitalist, very, very powerful, you know, right-leaning businessmen funding a lot of stuff that's pro-Russia. A lot of pro-Russian stuff coming out of think tanks is traced to, you know, big American money.
There was a thing we put together early in the war where, because it struck me how closely, like, official Russian propaganda, like, almost could not be distinguished from some people's commentary on the
from you mean like Quincy Institute and the Rand Corporation? You mean people like that?
Yeah, or John Merschmeyer.
Yeah, I mean, or Henry Kissinger. or Noam Chomsky. They sound the same.
Or, some of these commentators, and again, I'm looking through an American political lens, so I get a lot of American political crazies, but we literally built a site, one of those, a little stunt to put, here's a quote with no attribution. Try to guess if this is a paid Russian media source or if this is like some Western useful idiot. And let me tell you, it was much harder than you'd think because they're indistinguishable.
It's my belief that this invasion, signals the start of a new era. The world can't go back to how it was before then. And, a lot of people thought we'd seen the end of this kind of thing, especially in Europe. But this is real. It's happening. And it was on course to happen from 2014 onwards. Russia invaded Ukraine once before. It was madness to think that they wouldn't do it again and they wouldn't go for Kyiv. It was madness to not think that. And so many people were just mad. There's no other way to describe it. There's no other way to describe the hubris that certain Russia watchers dismissed these reports. I'm not talking about far left and far right cranks. I'm talking about, serious big name PhD people who are on big money, who are paid. Their one job is paid to report on this, right? That's their only job, is to analyze something like this and to talk about the risks. And they all, not all of them, but a large amount of them scoffed at it. And then since then, there's been a kind of worrying people that haven't really audited their views and to see how did we get here? How could we have made this mistake? We've gone back into a cycle of starting to put pressure on Kyiv. Starting to talk about how is this going to end? Maybe Kyiv should start talking about compromise. I mean, this is madness. This is a route to madness, surely.
You mentioned Syria several times and how Russia's actions in Syria kind of were specifically like a prelude to this. But there's quite a long history of this with Putin specifically, right? This is a guy who kind of rose to power via false flag bombings of his own people, of like apartments in Moscow, which propelled him to popularity. And then, I think you can talk about like Georgia and like stuff that's happened in Chechnya. And it's been a long time since anybody punished Vladimir Putin for acting aggressively and bombing civilians. And like, this is not the first or even the second time it's happened.
No, it's not, and that is their philosophy. That's how they conduct war. That is how they conduct war. And I saw something from Chomsky recently, within the last few days. He wrote something saying, Russia's adopting the UK-US form of warfare now that they're in the long haul, blaming the US-UK for arming Ukraine and forcing Russia to be in a position where they're degrading Russia's civilian infrastructure. And I'm sorry, that is not the British or American way of warfare in my lifetime anyway. There have been many things you can criticize and frequently do. Drone bombing weddings in Yemen, the Kunduz hospital. There are plenty of things that you can attack the US for doing. The Iraq war from fucking start to finish, the entire thing was a debacle. But they didn't start blowing up hospital after hospital, deliberately targeting them. They didn't seek out buildings with the word children written on and start bombing them. It's just, there's a difference between, doing something as a philosophy, and the philosophy of the Russian army in recent years has been to attack the civilians first. They would fly over rebel groups and they would bomb hospitals. That was their target, because that's the way you break a civilian population. And for years, they've just been able to do it with impunity. And after years and years and years and years of doing it, eventually, rebel-held towns in Syria started to fall after being starved and besieged and bombarded. And Putin learned everything he needed from that. The world didn't care. He bombed a UN aid convoy that he'd negotiated to be allowed into Aleppo. then he bombed it. He recorded the convoy on the way in, got Russia Today to broadcast this fucking live stream. They cut the live stream off and bombed it. And the UN said, yeah, Russia bombed the convoy. And everyone was like, okay, cool. Yeah, more gas, please. This is insanity, right? Surely. And all Russia does is just deny it. And then you get their apologists in the West who just repeat those denials, hopefully trying to muddy the waters and kind of force people into one of two positions. The first being, Russia's really bad, but what can you do? You don't want nuclear war, do you? And the other position being, Russia's bad, but America's worse. I mean, both of those positions are irrelevant to the subject of how should the world or anyone, good fucking decent people, respond to an atrocity, right? Or a regime that is perpetrating atrocity after atrocity with impunity. Surely there has to be a line.
I want to talk about some of those atrocities because you've been on the ground. You spent many, many months in Ukraine, and obviously you saw things that were quite heavy. I feel free to get into as much detail as you prefer to or as you want to, but what can you see when you're on the ground in Ukraine that you can't get just from reading news coverage there?
I mean, look, there's a lot of journalists have been to a lot of conflicts with and seen similar things, and some of them have written beautifully about, some of the things that they've seen. I'm just overcome with a visceral sense of anger when I remember those things. I just don't think there's any way to describe in words what it feels like to be stood over a mass grave of civilians that have been murdered. There are no words to describe the silence. So these are real people. These are happening to real people every single day, and they're happening to people under Russian occupation. That's what Russian occupation means. It means mass murder. That's what it means for Ukrainians. So any talk of negotiating parts of Ukraine to be surrendered to Russia means abandoning those people forever to that fate.
Why do you think this happens? And I know there's no real answer there's not a definitive thing here, but I don't believe that Russians in particular are just some sort of barbaric monsters inherently, they're born that way. Because I don't believe that about any group.
It's their regime. It is their regime. It is their regime from top to bottom. This is how regimes work. They strip away humanity, right? It's got nothing to do with being Russian by birth or by ethnicity or by what your passport says. It's got nothing to do with that, right? It's got how is Germany a liberal democracy today, whereas in the 40s, it was a fascist mass murdering dictatorship. What has changed so dramatically between then and now, in the way the people are, other than the way that their society is structured by their political governance, right?
There's a famous phrase from Hannah Arendt about the banality of evil. That, the most evil actions can take place from people just following orders, from just being a cog in a bureaucratic machine. And she was talking about the Holocaust, but I wonder if something similar applies here. Just following orders is.
So I was in Ukraine at the time, and I started. I did a thread quoting Arendt. It was Carl Bildt. He tweeted. A tweet of Maria Zakharova, the foreign affairs spokesperson for the Russian Federation. He said, it looks like they're beginning to lose it completely because of I can't even remember what gibberish she was spouting. And I made the point that Russian arguments are not for the world. They don't care what the world thinks. It's entirely for their population at home. That's the entire messaging strategy now. Before, in Syria, it was for the world. Now it doesn't matter. Now all that matters is the internal audience. Here's some of the quotes that I said of Hannah Arendt. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but for people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. That's it. But a lot of the troops that are caught by the Ukrainians have testified that they were told that they were in Russia fighting against Poland, and Poland is annexed Ukraine, and they were trying to annex Russia. Just whatever garbage you need to tell people to get them to do what you want is what goes there. Some more. The true goal of totalitarian propaganda is not persuasion, but organization of the polity. What convinces masses are not facts, not even intended facts, but only the consistency of the system which they presume to be part. That's all that matters. Russian fascism, the Putin regime. That's all that matters. We saw it before in Russia. This is not new. The Soviet Union had the same philosophy. It's a tragedy upon tragedy that's been, pushed onto the Russian people. The Russian people are not evil. Not even, there's nothing like, it doesn't even make sense to say that, but their dictatorship is evil. And that's just indisputable. And I think a lot of people refuse to see Russia in that light for many years, and I don't know why.
It's funny you bring up that quote from Arendt about, that there's no distinction between true or false or something like that, because there's a fantastic book about Russia called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible that basically talks about, the point of Russian propaganda is not to make you believe their propaganda, but to make you distrust everything. And so you just kind of respond with a shrug to every source of information, whether it's true or false or whatever.
That's why I was so I'm annoyed, because I'm like, Hannah Arendt spelled this out 70 years ago, right? Like, how are we, and I'm just talking about like some of my peers here. How are we still blind to this shit when it's so obviously in front of us, right? Putin was a fascist dictator for years. He didn't just turn fascist in 2022. His regime might be turning into a more totalitarian state now, but come on here, I'm losing my mind. So many people carried water for Putin, and it's all coming home to roost now. This is what years of impunity for fascism looks like. It looks like war, because that's the only language that fascists understand. It really is. So, we can keep twiddling our thumbs and debating about it or talking about who did what and who got it wrong when, but really all that matters is arming Ukraine to defend its territory. That's the long and bottom of it. And I saw that coming, from the end of 2021. And my focus became Ukraine is coming, the war is coming. There are two things that need to be done. One, we need to lobby as hard as we can for military support to Ukraine. And that was not very popular at the time. It might be more popular now, but people were talking about it being escalatory and all sorts beforehand. The Conservative government, to their praise, and I won't praise them for virtually anything else, they're clawing this praise out of my cold, dead hands. They responded proficiently, adequately, sensibly, responsibly. They armed Ukraine with the weapons that they needed.
I did want to ask about that. I wanted to specifically get that because, in researching this episode, I went back and looked at a bunch of your work and tried to read a bunch of your reporting and interviews you've done. And very early in the war, you were quite critical of the Western response, that the Western response is wholly inadequate and we're just watching this happen. But, looking at the timestamps of those, I would then see, that was before most of the major rounds of sanctions got put in, and most of the arms donated, tanks and missile systems and all sorts of stuff. And so how do you view that now as someone who was very, very critical early on of like the West is not doing enough?
I've stopped complaining so much, haven't I?
Well, I mean, early on, do you think it was justified, and then the Western governments were kind of prodded into actually doing something?
I think if they'd have listened to me now, more of Ukraine would be liberated, right? I think I was right, and I was calling the warning signs to send much heavier weaponry much earlier, before the invasion. And then my response to the sanctions were, this is not enough. It's not, and they might have built over time. But the West response was too slow because they didn't, the Biden administration was warning this was coming, and they didn't open the taps, presumably because they thought Ukraine was going to get steamrolled. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how because that's not something I could have invested much time to call.
That's another thing about Ukraine getting steamrolled. In addition to, there was this thing where people were saying, okay, Ukraine's not going to get invaded. We've gone over that. People were wrong. But once the invasion did happen, you saw this dominant chorus. And this was really dominant thinking for at least the first 2 or 3 days before things started to go to shit for Russia, that, well, this has happened. And so Russia's military machine is just way, way bigger and way more powerful. Ukraine has virtually no chance. Is that something that you had an opinion on early on? Did you expect Russia to? I
think people should go back and read my tweets in the early days. If they, they're all still there, public record. I was furious. I believed in Ukraine. I didn't want to get ahead of myself on social media. I didn't want to start making predictions, or because I was afraid at the end of the day, not so much for my own physical safety, but afraid of the consequences of what happens for Ukraine, for Europe, for the world, for liberal democracy, if Ukraine falls to Russian fascism. But I think I just use my social media every day to keep telling people that the Ukrainians are still here and they're still fighting, and that Kiev still flies the Ukrainian flag. And I focused on doing that every single day. And here's the question is did I think that Russian tanks might roll down the street at any moment? I don't know. I mean, the answer to that is probably best reflected in my actions, where I booked my hotel was I wanted to be right in the middle, so that if Russian tanks did come down the street, I would be able to cover it because I would be on that street. There was no way for the Russians to take the capital and take the political capital of Ukraine without going down these streets. And so, I think part of me accepted that was a very real possibility, and I positioned myself to be there if it was. But I want to carry on here. But from the day that I got to Ukraine, from the conversations that I had, from what I saw, it just seemed crazy to think that these people were going to lose, that they were not going to fight with everyone. I think so many people thought they wouldn't fight. That's why they thought they would fold so quickly. They thought they wouldn't fight because really the numbers Russia had were not the overwhelming manpower that you need to win an invasion. All the Ukrainians had to do to prevent it is fight as hard as they could, right? And maybe they still would have lost eventually without Western support. Probably they still would have lost. But to prevent that, blitzkrieg catastrophe, all they had to do was resist with everything that they could. And they did that. And I believed that they would do that from the moment I landed in Kyiv. From the moment I landed there, I didn't think there was going to be anything other than a fight to the very bitter end. in the darkest days in Ukraine, in the early days in Kiev, my feeling was that the West was abandoning Ukraine, and that with abandonment, defeat was inevitable. So that changed over the days. Where people have the ability to see what I was saying over the course of days and how it evolved and progressed. And once the heavy weaponry started arriving, once the sanctions started biting, things are very different. So it no longer felt like the world was letting Ukraine fight this alone. Ukraine is still fighting alone, make no mistake, but you can't look at the billions of dollars worth of military aid that have gone there and say that NATO allies most NATO allies aren't playing their role in trying to defend Ukraine as a nation, as a people, as a concept from Russian aggression.
One thing that you mentioned earlier on in the interview was OSINT. And for people who aren't familiar with what that is, if you haven't heard that acronym, it's open source intelligence. And it seems to really have kind of had a moment early on, especially in the invasion, where this was all anybody on Twitter wanted to talk about was what is the latest OSINT. Can you explain to people how valuable that was to you as a journalist, and how valuable is it as a source for keeping up with Ukraine, and like what kind of information are you getting through these channels, and how is it getting to you?
So I got introduced to OSINT by who was a very young journalist at the time, who was a young blogger even, not a journalist, at home. His name's Elliot Higgins. He had his own blog called the Brown Moses blog, and he would just take footage from Syria, looking at the weapons, and then start looking up their serial numbers and start tracing these weapons just by simple stuff, and also started a process of geolocation using videos and maps or satellite footage, and pinning landmarks from those videos and photographs onto a map to verify that this location is where it says it is in the video. And also, very, very clever people can look at the shadows and try and figure out what time of day it was filmed. There's really all sorts of things you can look at with a piece of footage. That you got to remember, and this is something that I think broadened my horizons as a journalist, is that filming something isn't necessarily proof in and of itself, right? Filming something is just a small window into an event that happened, right? That window is not enough to tell something conclusively in most regards. You need more, and you need to build a bigger picture, and you need to start by what can you verify as true, and what's suspect, and by a process of elimination using tools like geolocating, trying to source images, trying to find a location and time for when the images were uploaded. These are the kinds of beginnings of OSINT, to the point that it's now much more advanced. People using satellite imagery really heavily in their work now. Listen, that's how I got introduced to it in the early days of the Syrian war, when the Assad regime was dropping barrel bombs and using chemical rockets, and there were some really, really committed investigative figures. Elliot wasn't a journalist when he started this, but he has revolutionized the entire journalism industry, to the point that now every major broadcaster has a strong team of OSINT people. And if they don't, they're behind, right? They do their own OSINT in-house now. And again, I am not a OSINT-focused journalist. I'm just someone who, at the very, very start in 2012, 2013, 2014, when people were dismissing OSINT, it's just bedroom bloggers, what could they really know? I was like, this is it. This is a game changer. And it's coming back round to the modern day. I would say that no, it wasn't really the war in Russia that was a turning point. It was the chemical weapons research that they did. that was the start of it. You know, the OSINT had managed to uncover and prove that Assad committed these atrocities, these chemical weapons atrocities, before the UN had managed to do that, and the UN, you know, corroborated and confirmed their work in the end. It wasn't just that; the Salisbury poisonings, open source information, you know, led Bellingcat to reveal who the suspects were. They did that on their own through open source work. They are at a point where they are rivaling serious intelligence agencies and they don't have, you know, signals intelligence is the other important one. And this is where we come into how did we know that the war in Ukraine was going to happen? It was a combination of two things. One was the signals intelligence. The signals intelligence was being briefed to journalists by the US intelligence agencies, and the US government was saying, here's what we know, here's what we're hearing. We can't tell you how exactly we know all of this, but and they were accurate to within days, right? The Biden administration's warnings were accurate to within days. So the signals intelligence they were hearing was clearly they were getting communications between high-level people that knew that the war was coming, and the Americans had intercepted this, and then they started broadcasting it as a warning, right? This was serious stuff, because the Americans wouldn't normally reveal this signals intelligence unless they had a serious reason to, because it could blow their lines of, you know, surveillance. You know, if you give up that you've heard this stuff, suddenly you're in the Kremlin going, okay, who said these words that sound similar to this? Let's review. Let's see what line. You know, you understand what I mean, right? Showing your cards is what the Americans did, and that's where a lot of the skepticism came from. People saying, "Oh, this signals intelligence. Why should we trust this signals intelligence? They were lying over Iraq." You know, the intelligence agencies weren't lying over Iraq. It was the governments manipulating their intelligence to the people. It's very different. The intelligence agencies haven't been lying in this regard. They weren't lying here. That's the situation that we were in. I understand it's good to be skeptical of intelligence agencies. I'm not saying listen to everything they say, but this stuff wasn't coming out of thin air. We knew they had hundreds of thousands of troops on the border through open source information. So everything the Americans were saying, we could back up by looking at satellite imagery. You know, it was these two things together that scream alarm bells, right? So open source is simply just a tool. In its very basic, to describe it to a layman, I would say, if you're on Twitter or YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat and you see a video of someone in an event, could be any kind of thing that happens. Maybe, let's say it's a football violence, it's a hooliganism, someone smashed the shop window in. You know, that footage of from someone's phone is a piece of open source information. It's open source because anyone can access it. It's out in the public domain. It's not been handed to one spy by another. Right? It's not been intercepted from private communications between Kremlin officials. It's just out in the public domain, and anyone can access it and anyone can look at it. And that's all it is. There's no mystery beyond that. It's very, very, very astute people, you know, over many years perfecting a practice that involves looking at this open source information and trying to figure out what things we can prove are real in it. Essentially, it's very, you know, maybe I'm making a mouthful of that, but it really is just a tool to make journalism easier. And if you're not doing that, if you're not analyzing your videos to verify them, you're not doing journalism at the same level that other people are now. It's adapt or die. And a lot of people in Russia who rely on their Kremlin sources, who are in the dark and in the cold on this, they relied on them, who said this isn't happening, it's just the West talking shit. They didn't use open source in their work, and they look like clowns. What can I say? Your one job is to comment on Russia and you thought they weren't going to invade when, some fucking 21-year-old in Norway with a laptop has already mapped out the invasion route on a Google Maps document that's free for everyone to look at on Twitter. I mean, but it's criminal that that some people still have professional careers after some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. What I'm really getting out of it is that if we go and look at who smashed up the pub after the soccer game, we're going to see them traced back to your house, wearing the jersey that you wear. So, but no, it actually is a good analogy.
I'm a Man United fan, so it's not like we do much smashing up. I'll be like more the prawn sandwich brigade. But yeah,
a good season so far this year.
Look, I raised it because I wanted to say that it's not all just war stuff. Open source has its uses for all sorts of things. Stuff that's happening on your own street. It's just a way of using information and trying to analyze it. And it's a game. When I say it's a game changer, if you're not doing this, then you're not doing journalism at the same level that other people are. It's as simple as that.
Can I give you one more fun example here?
Sure.
Off the wall, but I know this happens.
Is this the Shia LaBeouf where the 4chan people found his webcam? He did a webcam thing where.
I don't think it's that. I want to hear about that, but I know instances where celebrity culture people, another thing in the way that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has lots of documentary evidence. There's lots of photographs and videos of which tanks have been blown up and so forth. Another thing that is photographed extremely frequently is celebrities. And there are people who have literally found like relationships with celebrities that they must have broken up with this person because here they're posting an image that is actually from 2 months ago. And why would they be posting an image from 2 months ago unless something,
you've got the nail
they've
on the
discovered
head.
Pregnancies. They've discovered just via really minute details of they were wearing this finger paint, on their fingernails in.
It's not that any of these ideas or ways of investigating are particularly brand new. It's that they were brought into kind of a philosophy, into a way of methodology rather than philosophy.
There's an ocean of information out there, right? And you just somebody has to sort through it.
Exactly. And how can you use that information? Well, it's it. You have to sort through all of it. And when you sort through all of it, you might start seeing things, right? And I'm not talking about, patterns like a conspiracy theorist. I'm talking about what can you verify? That's all that matters here in open source. What can you verify? That's literally all that matters. But again, look, other people, as I was going to say, the Shia LaBeouf thing, these were alt-right shithouses, I believe, that did this. And Shia LaBeouf is not a pleasant character, I'm led to believe either. But aside from that point, the reason I'm raising it is because it's not just journalists that have figured this out. A lot of people have figured out how to do this now. And when Trump got elected, LaBeouf put up some sort of webcam like "He will not divide us." I'm not sure what the slogan was, but people kept tearing this webcam down, right? And he kept putting it in really, really obscure locations to the point that I believe, this is the reporting that I read, it was out in the middle of a desert field somewhere, and people were driving around honking in their cars in locations that they thought made sense from overflight plane patterns, right? To try and narrow down that. It's crazy. They found it, right? And they found it quickly. They figured out ways. Every challenge that was set, here's the camera in a new location, but you can't find it. They found a way to find it, right? It's just what it is. It's collective. It is the way a hive mind works, right? If you can get 1,000 different people looking at the same video, one of them will spot something that 999 people didn't spot, right? And that one thing is a piece of evidence that might blow the whole thing apart. And it's a fascinating way to look at the world. It's a fascinating way to do journalism. And I just fell in love with it from the very first moment I began to understand what it was, and I saw the potential for it. And again, I really want to stress this so people come away from this and understand this. I am not a big, super OSINT genius, right? I struggle. I get my geolocation head on, and it takes me hours to find something that I know people can find in seconds, right? And I've seen the work that some people do, and they are so gifted at it. It's beyond words. So I don't want to claim that I'm one of those people. Please, I'm really not. I understand how it works, and I have applied it in my work, and I've used it to great effect. I proved a Russian war crime in Syria using open source information. But it took me days of work to do stuff that I know some people can do in a very, very short, an embarrassing amount of time. I just want to let people know that the power of this as an investigative method. It should send fear and terror into the hearts of tyrants around the world, because everyone has a camera in their pockets these days, and if you do stuff, if you commit human rights atrocities and people are around to film it, we'll find out who did it, and we'll tell the world. I mean, it's as simple as that. If one of us doesn't, another of us will, and we're all going to be pitching in together to help. That's just how it works now. People that do OSINT are very, very committed for the most part towards the rules-based order that war crimes are bad, right? This is what motivates most of us. I'm sure. Again, I know there's a few grifters out there but I digress. The power of this is to hold powerful people to account for things, and anyone can do it. You at home listening to this can start reading up on OSINT, and you can start putting this to use. If you've got some spare time, you want to help out, find out what's going on in some conflicts. Maybe not the biggest ones. Maybe pick somewhere that's local to you and see what you can do. It's a really powerful tool, and it's changed journalism and changed the way I look at things, and it played an important part in why I got Ukraine right, whereas so many people who have years ahead of me in the industry got wrong.
We've got just a little bit of time left, so I want to ask about the possible future directions that this conflict might take. I know that you're planning to head back to Ukraine shortly, in just a few weeks probably, and it seems like there's two things that could happen. Either this becomes like a very long, protracted struggle that could take years and years of time to resolve, where neither Ukraine nor Russia is really willing to give up and can't force the other side to give up. And then obviously the other thing that could happen is that the conflict actually does come to a close. Either there's some sort of peaceful resolution, or one side is able to just dictate terms via force of arms. So I guess what I would ask here is, number one, do you think it's likely the conflict will come to a close anytime soon? And if it does, what are the conditions that would make that happen? Because, like, for instance, you said earlier, you think the Ukrainian people's resolve is not really in question. So it may be more a question of, are they properly armed? So, sure. If the conflict does come to a close, either in Russia's direct favor or Ukraine's favor, what would be the conditions that would lead that to happen?
Sure. So I don't currently think that Russia has either the manpower nor the military capability to take the whole of Ukraine. That's off the table for now. Well, the reason I say for now is because the other question you posited was one about an indefinite conflict, a frozen conflict. That benefits Russia entirely. The longer, if this conflict turns into a repeat of 2014, where these areas that it was just the Donbass and Crimea, now it's the Donbass and parts of Zaporizhia and parts of Kherson, carving off a part of Ukraine. It's not ideal for Russia, but if the conflict's frozen, they haven't lost, right? If it's still ongoing, Putin's got all the time in the world to keep going. He doesn't mind if it takes 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. Why should he care?
I mean, do you put any stock in the rumors that Putin is actually quite sick and
I mean, listen. I don't care, to be honest with you. It's hard to, if I was to invest my emotional, well-being in the declining health of a mass murderer, that's the route to madness.
Well, not for the purpose of emotional, but there's some reports that he's doing this because people speculate that he's sick, again from some OSINT kind of stuff. But and he's jumping. He feels the need to do this now before.
The reason I say I don't care is because it shouldn't change the equation, right? Whether he's dying or not, we have to treat the future like he's not dying and he's going to live forever, right? That's how we have to treat how Ukraine's defense. Okay, it's a zero-sum game in this regard, right? It doesn't matter how long this guy lives for. What matters is protecting Ukraine's sovereign right to exist. Okay, so the point is, a frozen conflict benefits Russia. On a long enough timeline, Russia can win. Okay, on a long enough timeline, the world will get tired of helping Ukraine. Okay, that's the inevitable reality. People got very, very tired of Syria very quickly. The fucking world doesn't care what happens in Syria anymore. I could bomb a hospital tomorrow in Idlib and it wouldn't make a fucking headline. It would not make a headline, right? And I can't even get started on Syria right now. But the point being is that the longer this drags on, the more it benefits Russia. So how does this end? It does end through force of arms. There's no peace agreement coming out. It comes from one side strong arming the other into favorable terms if there's any kind of agreement, right? And all of the signs that basically Ukraine cannot afford this conflict to freeze. They have to liberate as much territory as possible this year, not next year, this year. We'll see how things develop over the course of 2023. If we're still back here in winter at the end of this year and the lines are pretty much the same as they are now, I'm not going to sound as upbeat. But the Ukraine can win. It has the manpower. It has the military ability. It needs constant Western support, military, humanitarian, economic, diplomatic, full spectrum support. And it needs that to continue indefinitely. If Ukraine gets that continued support indefinitely, Ukraine will win this conflict. But it requires Ukraine to completely outsource its entire war economy to NATO members effectively, right? And we have to be Ukraine's chest, a bank. That's what we are right now. We're Ukraine's bank. And it has to remain that way until victory. Alternatively, Ukraine signs away part of its land for... These are the theories, right? I'm just going to go through the other ones because they're just nonsensical. It does not make sense, right? Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, have no mandate to sacrifice territory. They have no democratic mandate to do that. The second thing is, Zelensky has promised that any agreement that's signed with Russia will be put to a referendum and democratically voted on by the Ukrainian people. And the Ukrainian people speak pretty much as one voice when they say not an inch of territory to Russia. Not an inch, right? So this is the Ukrainian government's position from the start, that not an inch of territory is to be surrendered to Russia. Who cares what the Russian government's position on this is? All lies. What they want is as much as they can get. That's all that matters to Russia. There's no point of agreement between these people. But some people in the West argue that it's all gone on too long and that Ukraine should surrender territory to Russia. Okay, so here's the two things. One, I just spoke about mass graves that I stood over. That's what Russian occupation looks like for Ukraine. That's why it's unacceptable morally and ethically. That's why no decent human being would ever suggest that. Okay, and I mean that, I'm going to reinforce that. If you suggest that Ukraine surrenders territory to Russia in some sort of peace agreement, you are not a decent human being. Okay, simple as. Because you are looking at Bucha, at Irpin, at those massacres, at those graves and saying, I don't care if it happens to those people. That is a better solution than war, right? It's as simple as that. No, I don't think that mass graves are a better solution than defending people from mass graves. I will never accept that as a solution, right? So, and then finally to the other point is the Ukrainian people would never accept such an agreement. So there is a war that's going to continue until one side wins, because that's what it looks like. And for one side, winning looks like not losing. So this is the severity of the situation. All Russia has to do to not lose this war is just not lose. Yeah. And if Ukraine doesn't win, not winning is losing for Ukraine. So this is what I stress to people, is that this war is only winnable on a short timeline with indefinite support and ramping up support. That support has to continue. We need more Patriots, attackers, HIMARS, main battle tanks. Ukraine needs fighter jets. It needs advanced anti-missile capabilities. It needs the full works. It needs a modern day fighting force capable of defending itself from a much more powerful aggressor.
All right, we are coming up on time now, so I want to ask the traditional final question that we ask every guest on this podcast. Where can people go to learn more? If they really want to have high quality information about the conflict in Ukraine, about what's going on there, what would you recommend that they read? And this could be people to follow on Twitter. This could be publications. This could be blogs, anything that you think would be valuable for people who have listened to this and who want to stay informed in the future.
Sure. I would avoid the Daily Mail like a cancer. I would avoid any opinion piece, even my own. Okay, my opinion pieces are not for people to stay informed about this. It's me arguing a case, and that's what opinion pieces are for. They're for people arguing a case, right? And the case that I'm arguing is that Ukraine needs military support to win this war. Okay, and that's the position I hold, and I hold that position because I want Ukraine to receive more military support so it can defend itself from fascist aggression. And for people to learn what's happening in Ukraine, if that's what they're interested in, avoid opinion pieces, because you don't need to hear my opinion. What you need to hear is the fact, and the facts are pretty well covered in most major publications. Right, maybe people won't like to hear that, but your CNNs, your Washington Posts, your Telegraphs are all doing really, really good work on Ukraine, really good coverage. New York Times, really good work on Ukraine. Again, I avoid all of their fucking opinion sections. Just don't read them. Doesn't matter whether they're for or against, just don't bother. Ignore all of that. It's fucking pointless. There's a reason that I argue these cases, because I hope that whatever platform I have, I can use to some benefit for Ukrainian people. But for people that are learning, trying to figure out what's going on, I would tell you to not trust people like me, not trust, people giving opinions unless you can verify those things for yourselves, and go and verify those things for yourselves. And if at the end of that process of verification and reading and learning, you agree with me, then it's great to have you on board. But I don't want anyone just merely sort of regurgitating things I say, because that's not the route to this. And it's using that as a philosophy that led people to think that Russia would never do something like this, because they believed in people that said that they wouldn't, right? And maybe one day when I'm old and I'm losing my bits, I get something really massively wrong. I hope I don't. I don't think I will, because I hope to use the same methodology to audit myself and audit my beliefs and audit the work that I do, to make sure that I'm always held accountable for it. But if I'm ever in a position where I do get something like that wrong, I don't want people just believing in it because I said it, right? I want people to have the wherewithal, the confidence in themselves, in their ability to read and interpret facts, to analyze those facts. That's what I want. I want an empowered society, because that is the strength of liberal democracy. That is what Vladimir Putin wants to destroy. He wants us all believing in fucking shite. He wants us all listening to fucking loud boxes, right? I might be a loud box, so maybe you shouldn't listen to me. But what you should do is read the facts and study hard, right? And hopefully you'll be able to see the wood for the trees at the end of that. That's my hope.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. If anybody does want to follow Oz, even after that don't follow me diatribe, which has some worth.
Well, follow me, but there's a purpose to it, right?
But don't use you as the sole source of information.
Don't use anyone as the sole source of information, and view everything I say with due skepticism, like you view due skepticism anything anyone would say, right? Use your own minds. And if you come to the same conclusions as me, I'm grateful. But I want you to come to those conclusions on your own. I don't want you to come to those conclusions because I've said them, right? It's really important that you see this for yourself, so that you, the next time a fascist invasion force is parked on, if you're like a 12, 13-year-old listening to this and the future is ahead of you and suddenly you're in your 40s and then the signs happen again, just remember that you could have fucking seen them. Like, people everywhere could have fucking seen the signs, right? It wasn't rocket science. It wasn't reading tea leaves. I did it because I worked hard and I figured out many things over many years and I saw the signs. And you can do the same. I didn't learn any of this at university. I just learned it myself over many years. You can do the same, and I encourage you to do the same because, again, I will stress this enough. I'm a big supporter of liberal democracy. I think it's the best invention humans have ever come up with, and I think it means more to the world than anything else. More than the Enlightenment, more than the Industrial Revolution. I think liberal democracy is the foundation of our society. And that is only made possible when people are informed enough to make decisions sensibly, democratic decisions. So inform yourselves. Nothing is more important than that. And nothing terrifies dictators more than citizens that are well read.
Well, we will link your social media profiles in our show notes and some of your recent work. And we're certainly hoping that Ukraine becomes a symbol of the success of liberal democracy. Hopefully we do see victory in Ukraine, and the suffering doesn't have to go on much longer. I want to say thank you one more time. I want to say please stay safe when you go to Ukraine in a month's time. And my guest today has been Oz Katerji. Oz, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini.